This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. We're going to get into part 12 of the Babylonian Woe by David Astle. If I sound like I'm a little out of breath or huffing and puffing, I just got done exercising for a half hour in my garage. I got to get in shape. I got to do something. So I have some equipment in my garage, and some of it that's broken. I have a nice treadmill I bought used a couple of years ago, and it's broken and taking up a lot of space here, and I don't know how to fix it, and I don't know who to call to fix it, but and I have some dumbbells, but missing 35-pound dumbbells, which I would coincidentally be using the most if I had them, but I don't have them. I have some other size ones I'm using, and kind of just bouncing around listening to music. It's really a makeshift setup I have. I refuse to join a gym. Absolutely refuse to join a gym anymore. Number one, it's way too expensive. And number two, I don't want to look at the eye candy. I don't want to be tempted like that. And if you're a Christian man going to a co-ed gym, I think you are not doing right. You should boycott places like that until somebody comes up with a male gym, an equivalent. I mean, you have all kinds of all-female gyms out there, and there's no such thing as a male gym where we don't have to look at butt floss on teenage women who are there just to be gawked at, where you just could be with guys and work out. And we men in America, though, we're so thoroughly emasculated. You can't have an all-male gym. The feminists would barnstorm it. They would besiege such a place, the ultra-feminists, the dykes. And then, there'd be enough immoral men, debauched men, who would ruin it themselves by way of homosexuality. So we're in pathetic shape. You men, you guys out there, we are in pathetic shape. We can't even be trusted with one in the company of one another anymore. You can't do it. You're so brainwashed into thinking you gotta be around women. You are. It's the state you men are in America is pathetic, and the oligarchs must get quite a chuckle out of your impotence and your failure, your obtuseness to even wonder why you're feeling so impotent. Why you are, in fact, so impotent. Anyway, without further ado, part 12 of the Babylonian Woe by David Astle from 1975. The origins of the oligarchs I was just talking about. Their very origins in ancient society. Where did these money changers come from? Let's get to it. Money creators and the political control. In their inception, so-called political parties were other expression of the principle of rule of tyrant or dictator. Though apparently instituted in opposition to each other, such societies or groups or even persons, representing such seemingly conflicting political interests, were the very natural outcome of complete usurpation of the essence of sovereign power, the God force from on high that gave life to a people or state. Through conspiracy in respect to interference with the issue of the unit of exchange, such front organizations are the natural result of the existence in any such state or people of semi-secret societies, can you say the Council on Foreign Relations, in one form or the other, religious or racial, alien by origin or otherwise, arrogating to themselves that privilege which formerly belonged to the God alone of the creation of exchange units, abstract or otherwise, can you say the Federal Reserve, quote unquote. The only limit to the amount of such private issue, especially if abstract, i.e. as by transferable ledger credit page entry, indicated by the use of assignments or checks, would be the limit dictated by caution against oversaturation of that money market, national or international, being interfered with. Naturally, it was usually borne in mind that the silly goose that laid the golden eggs must not be altogether destroyed, and care was taken that the real meaning of these activities, like those that the Council on Foreign Relations and the Federal Reserve, was deeply concealed for fear that ruler and people might come to realize the true nature of the forces at work in their midst. Each of these groups of persons, in the case of so-called political parties, or each of these persons in the case of tyrants or dictators, could not be but instrument for private money creative power. Such establishment of conflicting groups, each claiming to have the answer towards perfect government, and in the case of a constitutional monarchy, each swearing allegiance to the monarch, now but paid servant of money power, or in the case of a republic, each swearing allegiance to a president, in reality, an elective king raised up from the quote-unquote people, capital P, was a very efficient device of such private money creative power towards the maintenance of its own hegemony. Herein was venality and corruption enthroned. Such quote-unquote politicians as turned to look a little too closely at the hand that fed them, promptly found their quote-unquote perks, or quote-unquote political rewards, cut off. Should any government begin to be restless and unwilling to accept the axiom that it should have no real say in that most serious matter of all, monetary emission, the line of communication from the God in heaven to the people, then it would be but a short time before private money creative power transferred its favors to the so-called opposition. Funds would be made available sufficient to guarantee, under normal circumstances, their winning the quote-unquote election and their consequent assumption of the government. At the same time, funds would be withdrawn from the quote-unquote political party previously in control of the quote-unquote government, which would very likely mean that in the following confusion, men more suitable, quote-unquote, and pliable would force their way to the top, so that even if that particular government was re-elected, private money creative power would have no further fears. The price was always continuance of those policies most needed by such private money creative power necessary for its own real purposes, and therefore the continuance of its hegemony. The greater part of the units of exchange, as emitted by private money creative power, are of no intrinsic value other, perhaps, than those denoted by precious metal symbols, and with which the confidence of peoples and rulers was gained. Therefore, the cost of instituting that control of any state, so captured by private money creative power, i.e. the bankers, was virtually nil, since clearly such state financed its own lamentable condition. It is clear that each unit issued into circulation, of fraudulent origin or otherwise, that's fascinating. Let me back up. Each state financed its own lamentable condition. That's the Federal Reserve fraud right there. They print up the money, private bankers print up the money. Doesn't cost them anything but paper and ink, and we owe them whatever is on the symbols on the notes. And so we are financing our own lamentable condition. And it costs the bankers virtually nil. David Astle just describes it. Okay. It is clear that each unit issued into circulation, of fraudulent origin or otherwise, reduced by an exact valuation the worth of previous units as worked in the exchanges, transferring such loss of worth to the holder of the new unit. If later, with growth of industry deriving from the creation of such unit, all circulating units increased in worth, such increase in worth rarely caught up with the original decline in worth or purchasing power of those previously existing units. The steady decline in worth or purchasing power of the unit of exchange at any place and in any period of history will be sufficient proof in itself of the existence of secret creation and manipulation of abstract units of exchange by a relatively invisible force. Only under most unusual circumstances would even a sharp rise in the number of precious metal units circulating cause distinct and disturbing inflation of values without an accompanying fraudulent and secret expansion of the total number of working units through issuance of false receipts against non-existing valuables or non-existing warehoused goods, or by creation of transferable ledger credit page entry money against assignment of quote-unquote collateral. Precious metal units in themselves soon wear out, disappear for purposes of speculation abroad, or are hoarded. Thus, the creation and issuance of money constitutes free gift to the issuer when such issuer be private person. It automatically and immediately despoils he who thinks himself to have money or to be a person of worth. It is an indirect and hidden form of taxation, no less than any other such indirect or hidden tax. In continuing to speak of ancient times, such units of money, fraudulent or otherwise, were accepted by the simple folk as money, and seemed to serve equally well as had served that lawful money of earlier times yet again, which had been an order on the treasury or warehouses of the god of the city. Then indeed such units were money to all intents and purposes of the immediate needs of exchange. The fact of their legal issuance as a loan at interest against goods and services as collateral pledges placed in the hands of their creator and issuer the power of total discrimination, formerly recognized as being the sole and absolute prerogative of the god, through his servants, the priest-kings of ancient times, those who were the carriers of the breath of life eternal from God to man. As time went on, the fact of their creation, issue, acceptance, and effectiveness in the exchanges, once the people had resigned themselves to slow inflation of prices, placed in the hand of this private creator of these originally fraudulent exchange units all power. There you have it. There you have it, the American economy today, the Federal Reserve scam. Whatever the material on which the units of exchange or their divisibles or multiples were recorded, the customer still thought in terms of silver, as even today most still think in terms of gold, though none to speak of has circulated for 35 years or so. So long as the ruler concurred in the first place in the conspiracy to denominate these exchange units as being as acceptable as those previously issued by the God and his people, and between whom the king had been the connecting link, then the power of preferment or rejection was soon in the hands of the banker as agent for what corresponded in that day to the international bankers of today, totally in opposition to that natural order of life in which the unit of exchange represents the will of the benevolent God. Needless to say, this person would not extend his preferment to those who instinct told him might be able to come to understand the real truth of the emptiness of those shadowed vaults from which his hand reached forth. It might safely be assumed that discrimination would be exercised against those whose obliteration was included in the overall plans of those mystic, if not satanic, figures that lurked in the inner sanctuaries of the temple, mint, or counting house, in which secret places were formulated those policies that decided the promotion or otherwise of kings, tyrants, dictators, or political parties. The extraordinary wealth and power, according to the standards of the day, of this secretive and apparently humble money power is shown clearly by the following extract from the researcher Babylon. Quote, "We know that the Greek bankers were money changers. All the more important financial transactions were negotiated through their agency. Their counters were the meeting place of businessman and the stock market. They controlled at the same time the seaborne trade and the affairs of the caravans, above all in Asia Minor. The exploitation of mines was often in their hands. These guardians of treasure received the precious metal deposits belonging to private persons or traders, keeping open account for their clients, thus accumulating enormous amounts. They hoarded, they loaned to princes as well as private individuals. Listen then to the story of Nicholas of Damascus, more eloquent than any commentary. Wishing to carry the war into Caria, Aliat, king of Lydia, gave the order to his commanders to bring him their contingents at Sardis by a certain day." This is in 610 to 561 BC. "Amongst the generals chosen was Croesus, the oldest son of the king, at that time governor of Adramyttium and of the plain of Thebes, negligent and prodigal, ill-regarded by his father on account of his dissipations, very desirous of being received back into his father's good graces, and of confounding his calumniators, but not having the wherewithal to raise and hire mercenaries, the young prince, in order to overcome his embarrassment, resolved to contract a loan. With this purpose in mind, he sought out Sadyates, the richest merchant of Lydia. This person, occupied with his ablutions, firstly let Croesus wait patiently at his door. Then he agreed to receive him, but this was only to refuse him money. "If I must lend to all the sons of Aliates," he cried, "there will not be enough." Rebuffed, Cressus proceeded to Ephesus. There, an Ionian friend, Pamphaeus, learning the reason of his visit, obtained a sum of 1,000 gold staters from his father, Theocarides, who was possessed of considerable fortune, and which he hastened to bring to the necessitous prince. Thanks to these subsidies, Cressus, furnished with troops, was the first of all at the rendezvous, and regained the favor of his father, who took him in as partner in this expedition. Cressus later on revenged himself on Sadyates, who had turned him away, confiscating his treasure to the endowment of the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. The plunder taken from the unhappy banker was large enough to make 2 pillars of gold and the golden calves with which the temple of the goddess was adorned. Later we see a banker of Kylene, Pythias, of Lydian extraction, make a gift to King Darius of a plane tree in gold and a vine in gold. Some while afterwards, doubtless in fear that his immense fortune might only come to excite the covetousness of the prince, Pythias made up his mind to ward off the danger by making a concession. Spontaneously, he offered Xerxes subsidies for the war. As the great king was questioning him in kindly curiosity as to the extent of his wealth, the banker confessed, not without misgivings, that he possessed in his coffers 2,000 talents of silver, and that he was short of 4 million derricks by only 7,000 derricks. Sadyates, Theocarides, Pamphaeus, Pythias, wealthy guardians of treasure, possessing the confidence of the people who, as well as princes, envied their riches, struck monetary ingots in the doorway of their counting houses." Unquote. The above excerpt from the researcher Babylon and Nicholas of Damascus illustrates a clear-cut case in ancient days of effort by money power to control political succession. For the real reason of the refusal by Sadyates of the loan to Cressus, although not recorded by Babylon, was that Sadyates had already pledged himself to the support of Pantaleon, Cressus's half-brother, and probably was also the source of the rumors in regard to the quote-unquote unsuitability of Cressus for succession to the throne, and the unsatisfactory reports to Aliates. Pantaleon was clearly more quote-unquote suitable and more quote-unquote pliable than the strong-minded Cressus, who, Sadyates probably knew via his spies, would be his enemy. Although his offensive conduct towards a royal son would suggest he considered his position inviolable. The surly arrogance of this Sadyates in causing the young Croesus to wait at the door, and then refusing him his request in no pleasant manner, so typical of this class of person today, as much as in Croesus's day, undoubtedly caused Croesus to inquire a little more deeply into this precious metal money, quote-unquote, racket, when he finally did become king. A racket which allowed low and unsavory persons to make a mockery of kingship. The results of his inquiries undoubtedly showed him that, above all, for his kingship to be meaningful, monetary emission had to be removed from the control of private persons. Further evidence of history would suggest, in Lydia at least, Croesus destroyed the arrogance and power to subversion of this class of persons, not the most noble amongst his subjects, by the institution of the issue of equal weights of precious metal or coin as state prerogative. Thus, he thought, returning to himself as representative of the God on earth, that essential power so necessary towards the maintenance of true order in life, the total control of monetary emission. That the reputed fate of Croesus, after conquest by Cyrus, the new Persian monarch, founder of the Achaemenid dynasty somewhat later on, was influenced by the longing for revenge of those leaders of finance in Babylon's city. In one way or another, the main force behind Cyrus and his conquests, and for whom Sadiates would very likely have been important agent or co-conspirator, as previously pointed out, seems reasonable supposition. Hence the real source of the so rapid decay of all relatively recent civilizations and so-called empires of the last 6,000 years, whose establishment was so often due to the behind-the-scenes activities of bankers as agents for what was necessarily an internationally spread network of bullion interests, was the complete dearth in the later days of civilizations or empires of dean and noble men in places of control and power. Such natural and truly dedicated leadership had been destroyed, either by the planned discriminatory activities of the bankers or by the never-dying fires of war that maintained these so-called, quote-unquote, empires. Their places had been taken by the progeny of their slaves, or, as in Sparta, by their women. Clearly in that day, almost all money in circulation arrived there, created and issued by private persons of a class stranger to the whole world, and whose only guide was never more than their indifference to the miseries of mankind. Today, despite the continuance of the naive belief of those who toil from day to day that this money is created and injected into the circulation by the presumably benevolent will of the state, it is the same as in the days of the corruption and crumbling of the God-given distribution systems of the ancient Orient, in the face of the attack on their integrity by the privately issued commodity currencies of silver. This attack later having been intensified when, as a result of the stripping of the ornamentation from tomb and temple, both in Egypt and right across the ancient Oriental world, that silver apex to the inverted pyramid of abstract money by which the great banking houses were manipulating the exchanges became further augmented by gold, the magic metal so long dedicated to ornament for the god-kings in life as in death, or to holy ritual. That burning metal, almost a god in itself, now falling into the greasy hands of the money changers, exchanged with silver in the ratio, so far as the Middle East was concerned, of about 13-1. So far as Persian and Greek history is concerned, it will be quite safe to say that the apparent beneficiaries of such system were frontmen for a wider and more international system extending from China to Britain, of which evidence in China may have been that strange Hebrew community whose decaying fragments were found south of Pekin by the Jesuits who entered China in the 17th century. A community that knew nothing of the Talmud or of Jesus Christ, and who consequently thought in terms of Christians as in terms of a sect of themselves, and who undoubtedly were the descendants of the agents of a most ancient trading community. The evidence of this worldwide financial system in Britain exists in the gold staters of the Iceni, Cassivellani, Grigantes, etc., still existing, and which circulated there long before Julius Caesar. Although gold was obtained in Wales and in Ireland, its use as money could only have been inspired and organized from that central point where the original staters were minted, the Near East, and the cities wherein dwelt the controllers of international trade and mining. Amongst other principles of political power by money power, certainly one of the most important of all, used in ancient times, just as much as today, was that which is known as liberalism. Liberalism in simplified language, meaning that he who hath shall give to him who hath not. Not so much out of proper charity, but so that he who hath not may come to put his foot on the neck of him who formerly had, and who now foolishly gives him his own strength. Thus, money power, by injecting liberalism along the very arteries of society, through those underground channels under its control, made sure that what might be described in the language of today as, quote, permanent revolution, unquote, would prevent any power group from having control long enough to see the true source of that which is the power of the ruler, if he is to truly be in the saddle, namely, monetary emission. Money power, then as today, fully understood the necessity towards the continuance of its hegemony, of the promotion amongst the leading families of the states of corrupt persons who took pleasure in destroying their own. Persons basically corrupt who had deeply drunk of the poison of liberalism, persons possessed of the wealth of kings, because so pleasing to the central designing force, though at the same time having the natural outlook of the slave. A truly strange combination. One such family identified in ancient times with the promotion of liberalism and its attendant sister, welfarism, both equally beneficial to money power, was that Athenian family known as the Alcmeonidae, who, although suspected at the time of the Battle of Marathon, 490 BC, as being the source of the heliograph that sent information across the Bay of Marathon to the Persian commanders, strangely enough, they continued to maintain power and place at Athens. Equally strange had been the awarding of the contract for the rebuilding of the temple at Delphi after it had burned down in 548 BC to this same family in exile from Athens. As previously surmised, international money power above all must have sought control of the great temples and oracles. Delphi was such, and the oracle at Delphi was highly regarded over the ancient world. The building of a major temple was a gift which must have been arranged by those interests who were best of all served by the family policies of the Alcmeonidae. It might safely be said that if this same family had been rejected by Athens, the gift came from that financial force whose favor they had clearly enjoyed from generation to generation, namely, the money power that guided the policies of the Achaemenid rulers of Persia and Babylonia. Pericles, scion of this notorious family, while being the front man for those forces driving Athens into war with Sparta, was the instigator of the Donatives and later of Theorica, outstandingly undermining factor to Athenian self-esteem and national morale. Theorica allowed 2 oboli per person to the lessee of the oratorium, and thus 2 corrupt purposes were served. 1, it made sure all, or at least a great part of the citizenry attended the plays, thus keeping their minds off more serious matters, as do cinema and television, particularly in this day. Here we go with the bread and circuses. It predates Rome, of course. More especially keeping their minds off that most serious matter of all, which is true understanding of politics. In other words, understanding of the meaning of the essential forces that guided their existence. Boy, they've done a number on Americans. Wow, have they ever. Dumbed down idiot Americans. You think you know politics. Oh my gosh. Even your professors don't know it. What am I talking? Especially your professors don't know it. Oh, okay. And 2, it assured the lessee of the oratorium and that politician who most promoted his interests of a certain profit. A 3rd purpose would also have been served, although there is absolutely no record that says so, i.e., the maintenance of an unbalanced budget and consequent stimulation of government indebtedness to private money creative power, i.e., the bankers. If the sophistication of sales tax was known to Periclean Athens, it may safely be assumed were also known the sophisticated practices in relation to government indebtedness as practiced particularly in Anglo-Saxon countries today. Officially, Theorica was drawn from the Fund for War Preparedness. The only conclusion that can be drawn as to the true meaning, therefore, of the establishment of Theorica, so far as the bankers were concerned, was to further increase necessity of government borrowing in time of war, and so strengthen the hold of that so-called national debt, almost certainly held by themselves. Thus the principles of total hegemony of private money creative power were as clearly understood by its masters yesterday as much as they are today. The limiting factors to the complete destruction with which we are now threatened as a result of the flare-up in all this consuming cancer, which began about some 300 years ago, and now rages on virtually uncontrollable, were, at that time, that kings and councils still ruled, and kings still thought of themselves as the sons of God, the saviors of their peoples. If in any way they had understood the malignance of this growth that had penetrated the substructure of life, it would have been short shrift for its controllers. Hence the necessity for an absolute secrecy most restrictive in its effects. Clay, the material on which records were kept throughout Babylonia at least, did not have any of the potential of paper so far as went the keeping of records. Parchment and papyrus, while not standing up to constant use, were becoming increasingly rare and expensive, and vellum, relatively rare, was not known until the time of Pergamum, where the first books written on this material appeared in 198 BC. Neither did those states escape a certain international control of their money, such as did adopt the relatively new idea of coined precious metal money, but continued to use copper, bronze orichalcum, or iron, and whose value depended on the scarcity or otherwise of its circulating symbols relative to the need for them, designated a fiduciary money. For instance, in the case of Greece, the silver bullion brokers, who were clearly based in Athens, obviously would be able to control the exchange rates of such cities as used their fiduciary or national currencies if, as usually would be the case, such cities sought the good graces of Athens towards obtaining food and raw materials and towards marketing their manufactures. Thus, through the exchange rates, the bankers and bullion traders would also be able to exercise some control over the political life of such cities. The city of Athens itself, its monetary system based directly on their internationally required products, silver and gold, was clearly under their immediate control. If the state owned the mints, of which there seems to be no knowledge, it would make no difference. The states own the mints today for what it means, which is little or nothing so far as goes control of monetary emission. Okay, we are halfway through. And we're going to take a break now, and we will come back with the rest of this installment. Probably be the second to last installment of The Babylonian Woe by David Astle. We're back now. Going to finish up with the remainder of Part 12 of The Babylonian Woe by David Astle. With the end of the Bronze Age in warfare, from one end of the world to the other, enormous amounts of copper and bronze must have come onto the markets of the world as scrap, much of which would have been obtained at little more than the cost of its removal from national arsenals by the money changers or their agents. Where copper and bronze fiduciaries, as at Rome, circulated at values many times more than their value by weight of metal on the international bullion markets, relative to their value in silver or gold bullion, clearly such copper and bronze bullion, such as came onto the markets as military scrap, would have been more useful towards the counterfeiting of such currencies than sold at its bullion value. For instance, if the value of 1 libra of copper, as offered on the bullion market, if such could exist, at Rome, was 1 ius, the value of a minted ius of 1 libra weight, in an overvaluation of the minted coin relative to copper bullion prices internationally, would be as the demand for them rose and fell according to supply and demand. It appears that at Rome during the Middle Commonwealth, the overvaluation of the ius relative to the same weight of bullion was 400 to 500%. In the countryside and more distant colonies, often being far more. If in latter times, during the 18th century A.D., the copper ruble of Tsarist Russia issued at overvaluation of up to 800%, according to the value of copper bullion relative to the price internationally of silver bullion, brought into Russia a very inundation of counterfeits minted in Western Europe, clearly the issuance of ius at substantial overvaluation made the creation and of counterfeit coin an equally profitable affair in ancient Rome. Thus, international money power would have succeeded in diminishing the beneficial effects of national currency, continuing to use Rome as the example, by mass counterfeiting, which would have seen rapid increase once gold and silver commenced to circulate alongside the ius after the Second Punic War. Clearly the main purpose of the counterfeiters then, as agents in some degree of the international silver bullion traders, would be to inject their copper or bronze counterfeits into circulation at the best overvaluation possible, which would be through money lending in the provinces, at the same time requiring repayment, if possible, in silver and gold. Hence, the steady disappearance of the precious metals from the circulation was either due to the activities of the smaller moneylenders dealing in counterfeit, or due to the activities of the argentari or numulari making loans in exactly the same manner as the bankers today. Loans which never saw light as money, being always checks in transit, but which, in the final repayment were as often not gold, silver, or IS, the later being immediately convertible into gold or silver, which seems largely to have then moved eastward. This disappearance of the precious metals from the circulation eastward seems to have been a factor inspiring the vehemence of Cicero in his Oration Pro Flaccus. The indignation of Cicero, as recorded in this oration, may be traced to the indifference of certain persons who lived close to the Aurelian steps to the good of the Roman state wherein they lived, and whose solidarity enabled them to arrange to have mobs intimidate the proceedings of the court which heard a person, probably a member of the banking family known as the Lolli, attempt to smear the reputation of Lucius Flaccus, who, as praetor of Syria, had issued edict forbidding this movement of precious metals eastward for deposit at the temple in Jerusalem. Of Roman banking, the great 19th century scholars Mommsen and Marquardt wrote, quote, "The conduct of banking was done for the most part through the intermediary of the Argentari and of Numulari. These last were known under the name of collectari mensulari. In countries of Greek origin, there was a kind of state bank, as at Tenos, at Ilium, and at Tamnos in Aeolide. They were also in Egypt. In every nome was found beneath the direction of a royal employee, and through him as intermediary it was customary to make certain contracts and payments. Among the Romans, on the contrary, it was only in the most extraordinary circumstances that public banks were organized under the direction of state functionaries, i.e., mensa publica. Thus, amongst others, in 402 to 352 B.C., under the direction of Quinqui Viri Mensari, in order to facilitate the liquidation of debts by advances made against guarantees with state funds, and during the period 538 to 543, and then 216 to 211 B.C., for different reasons, and finally to carry out the collection of funds loaned free to the state. It was about that time that tabernae argentarii were established, of which the first indications are in 443 to 399 B.C., often occurring later on. It is through the intermediary of the argentari that most payments were made, as also they were entrusted with the collection of monies due, the placing of capitals at interest, the sale of merchandise, and particularly the liquidation of estates by way of auction sales, and finally investments of all kinds, exchange transactions, notably the changing of foreign monies and the sale of Roman money, appear originally to have been reserved to the numulari. Under this heading, we must first of all take a look at the dealers in exchange, who had to check the qualifications of new money. As such, they seem to have had a mensa from which they put new money into circulation, taking in the course of their business old money as well as foreign money. And it was their custom to set the rates of exchange. Outside of Rome, the publica mensae numulariorium appeared to have existed. In the second place, this description applied to private persons whose business was dealing in the precious metals. Concurrently with the argentari, they conducted all the activities that go with banking business. They accepted capitals for deposit. They made payments for the account of other people. They placed capitals at interest. And for exchange transactions, they leveled a charge or bonus. These bankers, the argentari, the same as the numulari, were placed under the surveillance of state functionaries, praefectus urbi, at Rome during the empire, and in the provinces under the surveillance of the governor. They were probably the subject of the granting of a franchise or investiture that was only accorded to a very limited number of people. In the case of dispute, they were obliged to produce their books, which were evidence of payments made and transactions entered into. For their franchise, they were subject to legal regimentation. These books were of three kinds. In the first place was a cash book, Codex Accepti et Expensi, in which, in order of date, were recorded the deposits and withdrawals of the argentarius, with mention of the name of the business and the names of the persons interested. In second place, a running account, Rationes liber rationum, in which the banking operations of the argentarius, with every person involved, were kept by debit and credit, thanks to which it could be known at a moment's notice how much the merchant was owed by every one of his clients, and how much he had to pay out to him. In the third place, a book was kept, Adversaria, in which were preserved records of the transactions underway, and even having their designations in code. Amongst these books, that which is peculiar to the argentari is the running account book, rendered necessary by the great number of transactions. The cash book, on the contrary, in which were entered by order of date the deposits and withdrawals, expensum fere, acceptum referre, was kept by every head of a family until the 3rd century A.D., at which period this custom fell into disuse. Mensae scripturae. The mensae scripturae served in that which touched the activities of banking, as much to establish contract as to furnish proof, and the greater part of payments were effected by transcriptions and endorsements recorded in the account books of the argentari. Direct payment was rarely made, but it was very often made through the intermediary of bankers. Whether monies had been deposited with them, for which they were obliged to give account, or whether it had been possible to open a credit with them, out of which they made payment following an assignment. Unquote. The above excerpt from the works of two scholars of vast learning is revealing. No doubt will be left with the reader who understands modern-day banking practices that, just as in today, 95% of all money in circulation is checks and assignments in transit, often written against credits granted by bankers where no actual funds previously existed, but, however, without which the drive and turmoil of this civilization could not have come to be. So it was in Rome and Greece. Indeed, for all those movements of vast armies, and for all those movements of peoples through the consequent sale and transfer of slaves, and for the erection of all those great works in stone, many of which still stand, from the Pillars of Hercules to Parthia and Arabia, the instigative factor was the same as the instigative factor behind all the mighty works and mysteries of today. It was none other than the driving force of that abstract money that none can see, but that functions just the same as that which can be seen. The mysterious quote-unquote credit of the banker. Force that once had been the will of a benevolent God, but now was an instrument towards the willful redesign and enslavement of mankind. In the late Roman Commonwealth and the early Empire, the assignments and checks in transit may not have equaled 95% of all money in circulation, and it is by no means impossible that they were even more, taking into account the fact that today's high-speed printing presses and coining machines, the fount of the 5% of the circulation that can be seen, can create these visible units on which the inverted pyramid of the invisible units is erected at 100,000 or more times the speed of slaves striking and finishing metal units of money by hand. In Harper's Dictionary of Classical Literature and Antiquities, Roman banking is dealt with as follows, in close agreement with Mommsen and Marquardt. Quote, "The Argentarius thus did almost the same sort of business as the modern banker. Many persons entrusted all their capital to them, and instances in which the Argentari made payments in the name of those whose money they had in hand are mentioned very frequently. A payment made through a banker was called per mensam, de mensa, or per mensae scripturam, while a payment made by the debtor in person was a payment ex arca or de domo. An Argentarius never paid away any person's money without receiving a check per scriptio, and the payment was then made either in cash, or, if the person who was to receive it kept an account with the same banker, he had it added in the banker's book to his deposit. This was likewise called per scribere, or simply scribere. We also find that Argentari made payments for persons who had not deposited any money with them. This was equivalent to lending money, which in fact they often did for a certain percentage of interest." Unquote. Thus, banking was carried on in almost the same manner in the Roman world as in our world of today. And to those who understand the significance of the practices of modern-day banking Nothing could be clearer. Even the ostentatious display of a metal safety deposit vault is recorded by the antiquarian Lanciana of the time of Hadrian, doubtless to encourage people to leave their valuables with the bank and so strengthen their quote-unquote confidence. In the earlier days, when the Senate was truly government in the saddle, that is, until the end of the integrity of the numerical currency, with the resumption of the striking of silver money, and therefore re-entry into the orbit of the silver bullion brokers, mining of the precious metals had been forbidden in Italy, and copper mining had been state monopoly, clearly indicating the futility of any discussion of whether the striking of coinage had been free or otherwise. Where the policy of the state had been to maintain an overvaluation of its bronze coinage relative to bullion prices, it is quite clear that it could in no way permit private individuals the privilege of the mints, free or otherwise. To do so would be to concede them the right and the power to manipulate price levels, and so, confounding the economy, dismay the rulers. Thus, it was not until the time of Cicero that evidence appears of private persons bringing bullion to the mints, significantly coincidental with the general collapse of the ancient manners and the essential forces that had guided Rome, as is described by Sallust. Such matters of state finance seem to have been well understood during the Middle Commonwealth. However, as a result of the Second Punic War and Trasimeno and Cannae, and the desperate need to rearm quickly that followed these unfortunate battles, Rome clearly had been obliged to allow the whole currency system to become based on the international valuation of silver as common denominator of values. She also had been obliged to permit the reduction of the value of the IS coinage to the value of its weight as bronze bullion relative to the arbitrary value internationally of silver bullion. It follows that it was only after Rome had thus surrendered much of her sovereign prerogative in money matters to the international silver bullion brokers, reluctantly, as was shown by subsequent events, that growth of liberalism and consequent undermining of the morale of the people and their government finally gave rise to the warlords known as the triumvirate, and the beginning of rule which might best be described as complete negation of that which had been government by decree of the Senate. With the reckless abuse of the powers of their imperium through those bankers who supported them, particularly in relation to their right to strike money in the field, the warlords derived virtual independence from the auctoritas of an already corrupted Senate, and when, in 23 BC, the IS coinage, which had been the backbone of the Republic, was returned to the Senate, with SC, Senatus Consulto, by decree of the Senate, stamped thereon, it was more in the nature of a concession to a dignity and authority that once had been the reality guiding Roman political life, but now had become a meaningless front, a shadow. Sounds like another Senate body I could think of. A meaningless front, a shadow. Thus, with the rise of the warlords, who were in effect would-be tyrants under arms, each with his own money power, was the triumph of the empire concept. In the case of Caesar, his supporting bankers appear to have been the L. Cornelius Balba, for whom the H. Hirtius of Caesar's I.S. coinage, as issued in the country of the Treveri in Gaul, seems to have been agent with H. Clovius, emittor in Cisalpine Gaul of Caesar's Orichalcum brass issues. Also, C. Vibius Pansa and Q. Sepulsius Rufus, all of whom are described by Michael Grant as, quote, eminent financiers, unquote. Of this period, the Encyclopedia of World History says, quote, if the crossing of the Rubicon marked the final fall of the Republic, the Battle of Actium signalized the final triumph of the empire. The last century of the Republic was characterized by the collapse of popular government. Because of the wide extension of the citizenship, the considerable adulteration of the citizen body at Rome by the introduction of un-Romanized Orientals, sounds like immigration in the United States, cheap citizenship, get people in here who don't know about rights, unalienable rights, and are more than willing to give them away in exchange for security, I'm sure. That's what all the Irish Catholic, Eastern European Catholic, and now Latino Catholic immigration is about. Cuban Catholic. That's what it's all about, folks. Get people in here in waves, in giant waves, who come from a culture that knows nothing about Scripture, the real Word of God, that know nothing about unalienable rights, but are used to being a cog, being a lowly brick in a pyramidical system, like we find in Roman Catholicism. And way back in the early 1800s, Samuel Morse, the American inventor and the inventor of the Morse code, wrote 2 books warning that this was explicitly the stratagem of the Vatican. And nobody listened. Nobody listened. And here we are today. I have also, by the way, I've read those 2 books by Samuel Morse. I've put those out on audio. You can hear them at Chuck Wilcox's site, ctwilcox.com. They're still up there. I have them in my archives, too, if you want to check them out. One of them is a foreign I forget the name of it. Foreign Conspiracy, Imminent Danger to the United States, something like that. But there's 2 of them. Fantastic works. It's amazing. He traveled to Rome and saw firsthand what that was all about, and figured out that what they were up to. And what they were up to, they have done. We're conquered. Even most Christians who know about the New World Order have not a clue as to what makes up that final brick the top brick in the pyramid, the evil, overlording cornerstone brick at the top of the New World Order pyramid, they don't know. Because Satan is so good at what he does, at conning people, at looking like an angel of light, and hiding behind things that look good and look beautiful. Oh, it's a beautiful, beautiful setup Satan's got going. Hiding behind the facade of this golden chaliced, multi-candled, extraordinarily ornate cathedraled religion, hiding behind all that as a nation state with a bunch of spies that are the premier spies in the world and assassins. Back to the book. The last century of the Republic was characterized by the collapse of popular government. The citizen body got flooded with un-Romanized Orientals. There was too wide an extension of citizenship, just like in America today. Although when you figure out what America is, you don't want to be a citizen of it either. You're just you become part of the corporate charter then, on the hook for all of the debt, which we are. All right, chiefly through the manumission of slaves, the growth in Rome of an unemployed proletariat, the rise of demagogues, and the complexity of the problems of government. The increasingly corrupt Senate had lost control of the assemblies, the armies, and the generals. The financiers, as well as the governors, saw in the provinces only a field for exploitation, unquote. Clearly, moneyers and bankers reigned supreme, as far as it was possible, behind some powerful military figure, such as had been Caesar or Antony or Octavian, or in some measure of direct authority, as seems to have been the case with Sosius, moneyer and financial organizer to Antony, who also came from a banking family. The same Sosius, when quaestor and governor of Syria and Cilicia, dethroned Antigonus, the last of the Hasmonean kings of Jerusalem, in 37 BC, after 6 months' siege, replacing him with Herod, later known as, quote-unquote, the Great, first of the Idumean line in that city. Considering how extensive a part the coinage of Sosius had played in the fortune, or lack of fortune, of Antony, Sosius was lucky to have been spared by Octavian. The absence of Herod from the deciding battle of the civil wars, the Battle of Actium, 31 BC, under the excuse that he was detained more urgently in Arabia, fighting the king of Arabia on Antony's behalf, may be the answer here. No doubt Sosius, in the same way as any good banker in ancient or in modern times, knew how to keep a foot in each camp. Equally wise was also his friend Herod. Q. Oppius, who emitted the orichalcum coinage inaugurated by Antony, also appears to have belonged to a well-known family of bankers. The name of the bankers behind Augustus does not appear to be known, but the extent of their massive operations is revealed by the widespread circulation of their heavyweight IS coinage from their mint at Nemason right across the empire, from Britain to Portugal to Pannonia. It may safely be concluded that their coinage circulated without discount and at par value with all other IS coinage, previous or present, state-issued or otherwise, or by imperium or octoritas. The question would be, was this excellent and adequate coinage, which so well met the needs of great military and civil day-to-day expenditures, and which undoubtedly was the origin of the sure accession to power of Augustus, emitted by an organization of similar character to the Bank of England of recent world power, or more recently again, the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States of America, both of which, though apparently state departments, in reality were private international organizations set up by the International Circle of Bullion Traders, or, as they are now generally known, the International Bankers. That which seems to be clear out of the fragments of information missing is that there was no such thing as a permanent interest-bearing state indebtedness until the period which may mark the beginning of the decline of imperial Rome, the significance of which is that no Roman government ever entirely lost control of that power so essential to the maintenance of its sovereignty, the power to directly inject the unit of exchange into circulation as according to its own needs. Of this period until the 3rd century A.D., the most learned Professor Heickelheim wrote, quote, "There were regular lending associations, while usury constituted quite an important item in the legal provisions of the Corpus Juris and the Talmud. Only state usury was rare, for the Roman state was still in a supreme position. At the most, autonomous areas were the only exceptions here. Large interest-free loans advanced to the state by individual citizens or chance patrons for reward in the form of honors or other more indirect advantage were quite frequent up to the 3rd century A.D., unquote. However, it may reasonably be assumed that even during the period of the Commonwealth and the true greatness of the Roman people, though Roman government had endeavored to monopolize all sources of the material of its tangible currency, and had prevented as much as possible the circulation of precious metal, which clearly would undermine the integrity of the state-issued unit of exchange, the grandiose IS, it still could not prevent counterfeits from entering the circulation. It could not prevent the corrupt practices of Oriental banking after the extensive re-entry of silver into the circulation as a result, clearly, of concessions made to the international bullion traders during the Second Punic War, nor thereafter the functioning of Gresham's so-called law, which such entailed, i.e., bad money drives out good, which, of course, depends on what is bad and what is good, nor, therefore, could it control the extent in absolute, right across the Roman Empire, of the activities of that underground that garnered the precious metal from the circulation for more profitable use elsewhere. As a consequence of the rejection by growing and powerful states such as Rome of the early and middle Commonwealth of the claim of silver bullion interests that all tangible money should be founded on their product as base and common denominator of values, and the creation and paying into circulation of their own tangible money, with value deriving from its scarcity or otherwise, using largely copper or bronze as the material on which its numbers were recorded, as previously pointed out. Much copper or bronze that came the way of the international bullion brokers would undoubtedly have been used in what must have been an extensive industry devoted to counterfeiting of these fiduciary currencies. The product of this industry, which would have been carried on abroad, no doubt, while yielding handsome profit, through disturbance of that mass of abstract money based on the tangible currencies into which such products would have been injected, would also create instability of price in the states concerned. Thus would be created conditions in which foreign money lenders would be better able to flourish and secure the establishment of their own peculiar systems of private money emission, based usually on the fiction of valuables on deposit for safekeeping. Under such systems, when fully underway, the next step would be political control through so-called political parties that such money power would bring into being, each necessarily dedicated to some quote-unquote cause through a so-called quote-unquote leader. He's describing the Republican and Democrat parties as they are set up by the bankers. Also chosen through the agency of such money power and by those forces it controlled. Such leaders would be quote-unquote suitable men. Oh, yeah. And would be chosen because pliable and, too often, naturally corrupt. That's everybody in Congress right now. Raised as likely as not from the lower ranks of society, and therefore dazed by the dizzy heights to which fortune had lifted them, such men would be most likely to carry out without question the policies required for the fulfillment of their masters' purposes and dreams, principally that of world government, which should raise such masters, strange thought though it might be, to the position of world rulers, and therefore heirs of the god-kings of ancient days in their own eyes. Although to the eye of any clear-seeing man, they might better have been called the anti-God, or, in the language of the naive Christians of a somewhat later time to the god-kings, demons. I wouldn't think that Astle would consider Christians naive for talking about demons, but I don't know what he means there. Anyway, that was the end of part 12 of the Babylonian Woe by David Astle from 1975. I'm Gordon Comstock. This has been the Ministry of Truth.